Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take a whole stack of sources, articles, research, maybe some notes we've scribbled, and really boil it down.
Yeah, get to the core of it.
Exactly. Our mission is always to give you that shortcut, to feeling genuinely well-informed. Not just rattling off facts, but seeing the surprising connections, hopefully having a bit of fun, too.
Absolutely. Keep things interesting.
So today, we are diving deep, really deep into a country everyone knows for its amazing culture, incredible landscapes, that energy, right? Brazil.
Carnival, football, beaches.
Right. But we're going way beyond that today. We want to explore Brazil's incredibly rich and, let's be honest, often turbulent political history.
It's a fascinating story, full of contrast.
It really is. And these patterns, these historical threads, they're still shaping Brazil right now. So, okay, let's unpack this.
And I think it's crucial right from the start for you to understand that Brazil's politics, its whole story, is just so tied up with its sheer size and its incredibly diverse population.
The scale is just mind-boggling.
It really is. We're talking about 8.5 million square kilometers.
Yeah.
It's huge. The biggest country in South America, bordering 10 other nations. So strategically, it's a massive player.
You can't ignore it.
You really can't. And the population, over 213 million people now. It's this amazing mix, this tapestry, indigenous roots, centuries of African influence in the slave trade, European immigrants.
All feeding into this complex identity.
Exactly. And each thread adds complexity to its politics, its society.
Yeah.
So throughout this deep dive, we'll try to connect those dots, between these basic facts, the geography, the people, and the big recurring themes in Brazil's story.
Oh, what kind of themes?
Well, the deep impact of colonialism and slavery, obviously. That casts a long shadow. Then there's this cycle, this back and forth between authoritarian rule and these really passionate pushes for democracy.
Right.
Plus the constant role of powerful social movements.
Yeah.
And underline almost everything, that persistent, massive issue of inequality.
It seems to touch everything.
It really does. These aren't just history lessons. These forces are actively shaping Brazil's political reality today. Ayeng, laying the groundwork. Brazil's deep roots.
Okay, so let's start with that sheer size you mentioned.
Yeah.
Because the vastness of Brazil isn't just a map feature, is it? It's like a political force in itself.
Absolutely. It fundamentally shapes governance.
Yeah, I mean, you've got these massive regional differences that make national unity, cohesive policy, just incredibly challenging.
It's a constant balancing act.
Think about it. You have São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, huge economic engines, right?
Yeah.
Almost like separate countries in terms of their economic power, industry, finance.
Global cities, really.
Exactly. But then you go outside those centers and you find these enormous rural areas, vast stretches of land that often lack the basics. We're talking paved roads, reliable power, clean water sometimes.
Basic infrastructure that's taken for granted elsewhere.
And the resources needed for development just aren't there, or aren't distributed evenly.
Right, which creates this inherent tension.
Yeah, this divide between the developed, powerful urban centers where a lot of the political clout resides and the more traditional, often struggling rural communities.
Communities that feel left behind, marginalized.
Absolutely. Imagine trying to write national policies that work for a super modern city and a remote village in the Amazon at the same time.
It's almost impossible to satisfy everyone.
It's a huge challenge. How do you allocate resources fairly? How do you create unified progress? It's an ongoing struggle.
And that physical vastness, that geographic challenge, it's mirrored, as you said, by this incredibly rich but also complex demographic tapestry with really profound political implications.
Well, I touched on the mix. Indigenous, African, European.
Exactly. Indigenous peoples there for millennia before any Europeans arrived.
Yeah.
Then, tragically, millions of Africans brought over forcibly during colonization.
Yeah.
And later waves, 19th, 20th century, Europeans, Italians, Germans, Portuguese, Spanish, and Japanese immigrants, too.
Creating this incredible cultural blend.
It really did. It's given Brazil its unique music, food, its vibrant celebrations. It's undeniable.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, yes. This diversity has also been a major source of tension. Ongoing struggles around identity politics, representation. It's complicated.
How does that play out politically?
Take Afro-Brazilians, for example.
Yeah.
Their cultural contributions are immense, and they make up a majority of the population if you include mixed-race individuals.
Right.
Yet, they consistently face systemic inequalities in many forms. They're significantly underrepresented in political office, local councils, state legislatures, the National Congress.
So their voices aren't fully heard in the halls of power.
Precisely. And they face disproportionate socioeconomic challenges compared to white Brazilians. Education, employment, access to health care. The disparities are stark.
And that lack of representation means their specific concerns can get overlooked.
Easily sidelined in policy debates, yeah. Then add that urban-rural split we talked about.
Right. The high urbanization rate.
Yeah, about 86% urban as of 2020, one of the highest rates globally. That puts immense pressure on cities' demands for transport, housing, jobs. Municipal resources are often stretched thin.
While rural areas have different struggles.
Completely different. Out there, agriculture is often still key, and they're grappling with things like land reform disputes and a handover from colonial times, really, with huge estates, the latifundios, dominating the landscape.
A fight that's been going on for centuries.
Exactly. And these rural populations often feel cut off from national politics, their needs ignored by the urban centers. So when you're thinking about Brazil's political landscape, you really had to keep these things in mind. The sheer scale, the unique population mix, the resulting divides. It sets Brazil apart, creates a very specific set of challenges.
It makes sense. You can't understand the present without digging into that past. Which brings us to colonialism and slavery. Their shadows seem to stretch over everything.
They absolutely do. It's fundamental.
So the Portuguese arrive in 1500, and they bring a totally different way of governing, right? Compared to the indigenous societies already there.
Completely different. The Portuguese system was centralized, top-down, hierarchical.
And the indigenous groups, like the Tupinamba or the Guarani.
They had complex societies too, but based much more on kinship, community ties, consensus, leadership. The caciques often emerged through respect and influence, not imposed authority. Decisions were more collective, often involving elders, councils like the Guarani's AT. Their governance was tuned into their environment, focused on community well-being.
A very different model.
Totally. But the Portuguese weren't interested in that model. They were driven by economic goals, first Brazil wood, then sugar, gold later, resource extraction.
Right, profit.
So they quickly imposed their own structures, carved up the land into these huge captaincies starting in 1534, gave them to nobles or loyalists back in Portugal.
Which just sideline indigenous governance completely.
Absolutely. Indigenous systems were marginalized, dismantled, or sometimes twisted to serve European interests. Traditional leaders lost authority. It wasn't just a change of rulers. It was an attack on their whole way of life, their political autonomy. Their collective will just didn't matter to the colonial power. And what's fascinating, in a really tragic way, is how those early structures cast such incredibly long shadows, especially slavery and the racial hierarchy it created.
The move from indigenous labor to African slavery.
Yeah, initially the Portuguese tried to enslave indigenous people, but European diseases decimated populations, and the exploitation was just brutal. So by the mid-16th century, they shifted.
And Brazil became the largest importer of enslaved Africans.
By far. An estimated 4.9 million people brought across the Atlantic over 3 centuries, more than any other place in the Americas. It utterly transformed the colony, especially the sugar plantations in the Northeast. The whole economy became dependent on this horrific system.
And that created a rigid social structure.
Immediately, a brutal racial hierarchy. White landowners, the señores de ingenio, the sugar mill owners, were at the very top. Unchallenged power, immense wealth built on forced labor.
And enslaved Africans at the absolute bottom.
Treated as property, dehumanized, subjected to unimaginable cruelty. And even free black people, those who managed to gain freedom, still faced huge social and economic barriers. Marginalized.
How does that connect to today? It seems like such a long time ago.
Well, what's really insightful and perhaps unique about Brazil compared to, say, the U.S., is how this hierarchy didn't just vanish with abolition in 1888. It sort of morphed, embedded itself into the social fabric, but was often masked by this powerful myth of racial democracy.
The idea that Brazil was somehow free of racism.
Exactly. This narrative became very strong that Brazil was a harmonious blend of races without the prejudice seen elsewhere. It was a comforting idea, but it obscured the deep-seated systemic discrimination that continued.
Making it harder to address.
Much harder. If you officially or culturally deny the problem exists, how do you fix it? It makes tackling contemporary issues like police violence, which disproportionately affects black communities, or their underrepresentation in politics and business, incredibly challenging.
So the legacy isn't just economic disparity.
No, it's deeply cultural and political too. Afro-Brazilians are still heavily overrepresented in poor communities, facing hurdles in education, jobs, social mobility, and sadly, incidents of police violence against black Brazilians are stark reminders of these ongoing racial tensions, with roots stretching right back to those colonial hierarchies. Those centuries-old structures are still shaping lives today, too. Cycles of power, from empire to republic's early struggles.
Okay, so with those colonial foundations, the hierarchy, the economic drivers, it's really interesting how Brazil actually gained independence. It was quite different from its neighbors, wasn't it?
Very different. Much less violent, relatively peaceful compared to the wars across Spanish America. Almost managed.
And it all came down to Napoleon, strangely enough.
In a way, yes. The Napoleonic Wars forced the entire Portuguese royal family, King Juan VI, the Queen, the whole court, to flee Portugal in 1808. And where did they go?
Straight to Rio de Janeiro, their biggest colony.
Exactly. Imagine that. The entire imperial center suddenly transplanted to the colony. Overnight, Rio wasn't just a colonial port. It was the capital of the Portuguese Empire.
That must have had a huge psychological impact.
Immense. It inadvertently boosted Brazilian elite's sense of importance, fostered a kind of early nationalism. They were suddenly at the center of things.
And when the royals went back to Portugal after Napoleon was defeated?
The king's son, Dom Pedro, stayed behind. He'd grown attached to Brazil, saw the rising tide of sentiment for autonomy. That was the key decision.
Setting the stage for the break.
Precisely. The moment came on September 7, 1822. Dom Pedro's famous cry, Independencia ou morte, independence or death. And Brazil became an independent empire, not a republic like its neighbors, with Dom Pedro I as emperor.
An empire, not a republic. Why that choice?
Well, analyzing the structure of that new empire tells us a lot. The 1824 Constitution set up a constitutional monarchy. On paper, power was shared.
But in reality?
In reality, it gave enormous power to the emperor. Strong executive authority. It reflected the elite's desire to keep things centralized, avoid the fragmentation they saw happening in the Spanish-speaking republics.
So separation of powers was kind of nominal.
It existed, executive, legislative, judiciary. But Dom Pedro had significant authority. He could dissolve the legislature, appoint ministers, intervene quite freely. The lines were definitely blurred.
And who got to participate?
That was a major criticism. The Constitution heavily favored the elites. Voting was restricted to male citizens with significant property.
So most people were excluded. Women, the poor, enslaved people.
Completely excluded, which reinforced those old colonial social divisions and immediately bred resentment.
Did the empire face other problems?
Oh, yes. Right from the start. The economy struggled with fluctuating coffee prices. Coffee was becoming the big, new commodity, and there were growing abolitionist movements challenging the slave system, which was still the bedrock of the economy.
So pressure from multiple sides.
Absolutely. That, plus Dom Pedro's rather autocratic style, led to growing opposition. He actually abdicated in 1831, less than 10 years after independence.
That quickly? Wow.
Yeah, it set a worrying precedent for instability and the weakness of that centralized model.
And you mentioned regionalism earlier. Did that continue under the empire?
Massively. It was a constant underlying tension. And really, it's been a theme throughout Brazil's history. Remember the size of the country.
Right, the vastness.
You had provinces with very different economies, cultures, interests. The Northeast was still largely based on the old sugar economy. The Southeast was booming with coffee.
So their priorities clashed?
Often, yes. Policies coming from Rio didn't always suit everyone. The central government struggled to impose its will uniformly.
Did this lead to actual conflict?
It did. Sometimes quite violent conflicts. Take the Sabanada Rebellion in Bahia, 1848 to 1850. That was an urban middle-class and military movement wanting more autonomy.
Okay.
Or, even bigger, the Ragamuffin War Guerra dos Farrapos down south in Rio Grande do Sul. That lasted 10 years, 1835 to 1845.
10 years? Wow.
Yeah, led by powerful ranchers, furious about taxes and central control. They even declared an independent republic for a while.
So these weren't small skirmishes.
Not at all. There were serious challenges to imperial authority, showing just how deep those regional divisions ran. These conflicts drained resources, undermined stability, made it hard to build a truly cohesive nation. You can see how these early power struggles set the pattern for future instability.
Okay, so the empire collapses in 1889. A military coup establishes the First Republic. Federalism is the new buzzword, right? Power to the states.
That was the idea, yes.
Yeah.
The 1891 Constitution enshrined federalism, decentralized power, create a more modern democratic system after the monarchy.
But did it work out that way? Did it really break from the old elite control?
Well, that's the crucial question. On paper, states got more power. But in practice, control largely stayed with the same powerful landowning families and wealthy merchant elites within each state.
So decentralization, but still oligarchic.
Pretty much. True democratic participation, social mobility for the masses, still very limited. And the Republic immediately struggled. There wasn't a strong sense of national identity binding everyone together.
Instead, you had powerful state bosses.
Exactly. State-level oligarchs who had immense local power bases, they constantly challenged or ignored the central government in Rio. It wasn't a truly unified republic in practice.
And this period, 1889 to 1930, was notoriously unstable, wasn't it?
Extremely volatile. Political instability was the norm. Constant power struggles between factions, between states. Governments changed frequently, often lasting only a short time.
And this system of Colonialismo was key here. Tell us about that.
Colonialism. It's fundamental to understanding this era, and its legacy lingers. It was this deeply embedded system, especially in rural areas. You had these powerful local landowners, the corones.
Like local bosses.
More than that. They were often the law, the providers, the protectors in the region. They controlled votes through patronage, giving jobs, favors, land access, even protection in return for absolute political loyalty.
So votes were bought and sold, basically.
Essentially, yes. It was a system of dependency and obligation, very personal, almost feudal. These corones ran local political machines that were fiercely loyal to them, not necessarily to any national party or ideology. They could block reforms, deliver votes, and maintain their grip, regardless of who was president in Rio.
And this fed into the coffee with milk politics.
Exactly. Café con leche. That was the shorthand for the power-sharing deal between the two dominant states. São Paulo, the coffee giant, and Minas Gerais, the big dairy producer.
They just took turns running the country.
Pretty much. They rotated the presidency between their chosen candidates, ensuring their economic interests were protected. It was an oligarchic pact that deliberately excluded other states, other economic interests, and certainly any popular movements.
Which must have caused resentment elsewhere.
Huge resentment. You saw conflicts like the Federalist Revolution in the South, 1893-95. States pushing back, wanting more autonomy, feeling shut out.
So a recipe for chaos. Lots of presidents coming and going.
Absolutely. Over 15 presidents in about 40 years. Many served very short terms. There was no stable succession, no real political consensus, just constant maneuvering and instability.
And the economy was all about coffee.
Dangerously so. By 1900, coffee was something like 80% of Brazil's exports, a total monoculture dependency.
Making the country incredibly vulnerable.
Extremely. When global coffee prices crashed, like at the Great Depression in 1929, it was catastrophic for Brazil.
Right.
Wiped out fortunes, destroyed livelihoods overnight.
Did the government try to do anything?
They did try something called valorization. When prices tanked, the government would step in and buy up massive amounts of surplus coffee to try and prop up the price.
The government became a coffee hoarder.
Effectively, yes. It helped the big coffee growers, the oligarchs in the short term. But it cost the national treasury a fortune.
And prevented investment elsewhere.
Exactly. It created huge fiscal problems, and crucially, it meant resources and political energy weren't going into diversifying the economy, into building industries. Brazil remained trapped in this risky agricultural dependency.
So you have this toxic mix. Political chaos fueled by regional bosses and oligarchs, and an economy totally reliant on one volatile commodity.
It's a perfect storm. The political instability and the economic vulnerability fed off each other. Widespread dissatisfaction grew, especially among the urban working class and the emerging middle class. They felt the system wasn't working for them.
The old ways weren't cutting it anymore.
Not at all. People were desperate for change. And this deep frustration, combined with new political ideas floating around, created the perfect conditions for a new kind of leader to emerge. It really raises that question. How did all this dysfunction pave the way for someone like Getulio Vargas? Third, the rise of strongmen, Vargas and the military regimes.
That's the perfect transition. Because after decades of that oligarchic instability, that economic fragility, Brazil must have been desperate for something different. So who was Getulio Vargas, and how did he manage to step into that power vacuum so effectively?
Vargas is arguably one of the most pivotal figures in 20th century Brazilian history. He came to power not through an election initially, but through a coup in 1930.
Right in the middle of the post-1929 crash chaos.
Exactly. The timing was crucial. The old republic was discredited. The economy was in tatters. Vargas was a skilled politician. He managed to unite different discontented groups, parts of the military fed up with the coffee oligarchs, and also the growing urban industrialist class who wanted the state to play a bigger role in modernization.
But his appeal went beyond the elites, didn't it? He connected with ordinary people.
Massively. That was his genius, really. He had this incredible populist appeal, especially to the urban working class and the lower middle classes. He talked about nationalism, social justice, standing up for Brazil.
How did he project that image?
He was a master of communication for his time. Used radio extensively, a relatively new medium, then to speak directly to people in their homes. Held huge rallies. He carefully crafted this image of himself as the father of the poor, a strong paternal figure who would look after the common man.
Creating a very personal bond with millions.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about policies, it was about him, his personality. He cultivated this strong emotional connection that really bypassed the old political structures. And here's where it gets really interesting, looking at Vargas's actual impact. His time in power, particularly the initial period and then Estado Novo, was genuinely transformative. He fundamentally believed the state needed to intervene in the economy.
To modernize and break that dependency.
Precisely. Economic independence was a key goal. So he established major state-owned companies. The National Steel Company, CSN, was huge, vital for kickstarting heavy industry. He invested heavily in infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, to try and knit the vast country together and support industrial growth.
Moving away from just coffee.
Definitely. He created agencies like the National Department of Mineral Production, the National Development Bank, which later became BNDES, all aimed at stimulating different sectors, diversifying the economy.
But maybe his biggest legacy was in labor rights?
Arguably, yes. This is what really cemented his support among the working class. He created the Ministry of Labor in 1931, and then the big one, the Consolidation of Labor Laws, CLT, in 1943.
What did the CLT do?
It was revolutionary for Brazil at the time. It codified basic workers' rights, things like a minimum wage, paid vacations, an 8-hour workday, though initially 48 hours a week, overtime pay, protections against unfair dismissal, Social Security contributions.
Things that seem standard now, but weren't then.
Not at all. These dramatically improved living standards for millions. It also formally integrated the working class into the political system, giving them recognized rights. And crucially for Vargas, it solidified his alliance with the labor unions. He brought them into the state structure, managed them, rather than letting them become an independent opposition force.
So delivering real benefits, but also controlling them.
That's the Vargas paradox. He was, as you said, brilliant at propaganda, used state media relentlessly to build this cult of personality. The paternal protector, the nation builder.
Creating an emotional connection.
Deeply emotional. And economically, Brazil did see significant growth under him. He laid foundations for its later industrial strength. But there was a dark side.
The authoritarianism.
Yes, especially during the Estado Novo period, from 1937 to 1945. He dissolved Congress, ruled by decree, imposed strict censorship, crushed political opposition. It was a dictatorship.
So progress and repression hand in hand.
Exactly. He was eventually forced out by the military in 1945. But then, remarkably, he got himself elected president democratically in 1950.
A comeback.
A huge comeback. But his second term was plagued by crisis, and he ended up committing suicide in 1954, leaving behind a famous dramatic note blaming his enemies. His legacy is incredibly complex, still debated furiously in Brazil today, the modernizer, the father of the poor, the dictator.
That complexity, that blend of progress and authoritarianism, seems like a recurring pattern. Which leads us straight into the next major authoritarian period, the 1964 military coup. What led Brazil back down that path after Vargas and a period of democracy?
The early 1960s were another period of intense instability, setting the stage for the coup. President João Goulart, often known as Django, was in power. He was Vargas's political heir in some ways, a reformist.
And his reforms were controversial.
Highly controversial. He proposed things like significant land reform, redistributing large estates, which terrified the powerful landowners. He also advocated for expanding workers' rights and nationalizing some foreign companies, which angered industrialists and conservative elements, including much of the military leadership.
Creating a very polarized climate.
Extremely polarized. It felt like the country was pulling apart.
So what were the key factors that actually triggered the coup in '64?
It was a confluence of things, really.
Yeah.
Multiple factors feeding into each other. First, as we said, that political instability. After Vargas's death, Brazil had a string of weak governments. Goulart himself came to power under contentious circumstances. There was just no consensus, deep divisions between conservatives fearing reform and leftist groups demanding radical change. Goulart struggled to govern effectively amid strikes and protests.
So a sense of drift and crisis.
Definitely. Second, economic chaos. Inflation was spiraling out of control, reaching over 80% a year by 1964. People's savings were being wiped out. Goulart's attempts at economic reform were blocked by conservatives in Congress. This economic pain fueled discontent, especially among the middle classes, who started longing for order. even authoritarian order.
Then there was the Cold War context.
Absolutely crucial, the fear of communism. The Cold War was raging. Cuba had happened just a few years earlier. The U.S. and Brazilian conservatives were terrified of another leftist regime in Latin America.
And Goulart was painted as a communist.
Relentlessly. By conservative media, by the military, by U.S. intelligence. Even though he was more of a nationalist social democrat, the communist threat was hyped up enormously. It became a justification for intervention, portraying his reforms not as legitimate policy debates, but as an existential threat.
Were there other internal factors?
Yes, widespread social unrest. Economic problems and inequality-fueled strikes by labor unions demanding better conditions. Student movements were very active, pushing for reforms. The military and conservatives skillfully used this unrest, painting it as chaos and disorder that only they could contain. They argued democracy was failing, intervention was necessary.
And U.S. involvement, was that significant?
Oh, it was critical. Not just background noise. Declassified documents show the U.S. played a very active role. The CIA provided financial support, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and strategic advice to military factions plotting the coup.
Actively encouraging it.
Yes. The U.S. ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, was deeply involved, pushing the narrative that Goulart had to go. They stoked fears among the Brazilian elite. The U.S. also provided broader military training to Latin American officers, often focused on counterinsurgency, techniques later used against their own people. There was even a U.S. naval task force positioned off the coast, Operation Brother Sam, ready to support the coup if needed.
So a combination of internal crisis and external pressure.
Exactly. It all came together in March-April 1964. The military moved in, Goulart fled, and a dictatorship was installed that would last for 21 years.
And it was a brutal regime, wasn't it? What methods did they use to stay in power?
Extremely brutal. Repression was systematic. A key moment was Institutional Act No. 5, AI-5, in 1968. That basically suspended habeas corpus, allowed the government to close Congress, censor media, and arbitrarily arrest anyone deemed subversive.
Giving them unchecked power.
Totally. Tens of thousands were arrested without charge. Torture became widespread and systematic. Horrific methods, beatings, electric shocks, drowning, psychological abuse were used in clandestine detention centers like the DOI Cody.
But forced disappearances, too.
Yes. The National Truth Commission later estimated over 800 people were disappeared, kidnapped, tortured, killed, their bodies often never found, leaving families in perpetual agony. Political opponents were assassinated, sometimes by official forces, sometimes as shadowy death squads operating with impunity.
Was there resistance?
There was. Despite the intense repression, students, intellectuals, artists, unionists, and some armed guerrilla groups like the ALN, Ação Libertador Nacional, tried to fight back.
How effective was that armed resistance?
Militarily, they were eventually crushed. But their existence and the sheer brutality the regime used against them and against peaceful dissenters ironically helped to fuel opposition over time. It exposed the regime's violence, garnered sympathy for the victims, and eventually contributed to the growing public demand for a return to democracy. But the scars of that period, the trauma, they run incredibly deep in Brazilian society. You have to consider the lasting impact of living under that kind of fear and violence for 2 decades. For Brazil's democratic rebirth and enduring challenges.
So, after 21 years of that darkness, how did Brazil finally emerge? How did it transition back to democracy? It must have been a huge moment.
It was a massive, pivotal moment. The end of military rule in 1985 wasn't sudden, though. It was a gradual process, really pushed forward by growing public pressure and civil society mobilization.
Like the Diretas Já movement.
Exactly. Direct elections now. In the early 80s, millions poured onto the streets in cities across Brazil, demanding the right to directly elect their president again, after years of the military appointing generals. It was a huge, powerful display of popular will.
Were there other steps along the way?
Yes. Things like the 1979 amnesty law were important. It allowed political exiles to return, pardoned many political prisoners, though controversially it also amnestied torturers. And having direct elections for state governors in 1982 was a crucial step, showing democracy could function again. It all gradually weakened the military's resolve to cling to power.
And this process culminated in the 1988 Constitution.
Absolutely. The 1988 Constitution is the bedrock of modern Brazilian democracy. It was drafted by a popularly elected constituent assembly and was seen as a definitive break from the authoritarian past.
What were its main goals?
To guarantee fundamental rights, establish a strong separation of powers, promote social inclusion, address historical inequalities, and crucially, put safeguards in place to prevent another dictatorship. It was incredibly ambitious, often called the Citizen Constitution.
Trying to build democracy from the ground up.
Precisely. It aimed to embed democratic values deeply into the legal and political framework. It wasn't just a set of rules. It was envisioned as a social pact for a more just and democratic Brazil. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that 1988 Constitution really did try to tackle those historical wrongs and reshape society. It's packed with rights guarantees. Article 5 is key, listing rights to life, liberty, equality, security, property, the foundation for civil rights.
What about political participation?
A huge emphasis on that. Universal suffrage, as we mentioned, but also mandatory voting. This makes participation a civic duty, leading to those very high turnouts, like nearly 80% in 2022. It ensures broad engagement, even if it means the electorate is sometimes fragmented.
And freedom of speech after years of censorship?
Absolutely vital, guaranteed in Article 5. It led to a much more open public square. Though, as we see now, it brings challenges too. Navigating misinformation and hate speech online is a major test for the courts and society.
What other rights stand out?
Freedom of assembly is key. Also Article 5. This enabled peaceful protest, like those massive 2013 demonstrations about bus fares that snowballed into broader protests against corruption and poor public services. It showed citizens could use that right effectively. And the right to due process protection against arbitrary arrest, fair trials, hugely important after the dictatorship, though, again, challenges remain in ensuring this applies equally to everyone, especially marginalized groups facing police violence.
Did it address economic issues? Inequality?
Yes. Significantly. Article 6 lays out social rights education, health, work, housing, social security. This wasn't just symbolic. It paved the way for major social welfare programs.
Like Bolsa Familia.
Exactly. Bolsa Familia, started in 2003, was a direct outcome of this constitutional commitment. A conditional cash transfer program, families got money if kids went to school and got health checks. It lifted tens of millions out of extreme poverty, maybe 36 million between 2003 and 2010. A huge impact on inequality, even became a global model.
Did it try to address past injustices directly?
It did. There was a commitment to acknowledge past abuses, which eventually led to the National Truth Commission in 2012 investigating dictatorship-era crimes. And very importantly, it included provisions recognizing indigenous rights, including the crucial right to land demarcation under Article 231, a vital step given the history of dispossession.
So really trying to create a more inclusive society.
That was the aim. Promoting citizen participation through things like public policy councils, where citizens can advise on specific issues, and allowing for referendums. Brazil also signed up to major international human rights treaties, integrating those standards into its own laws. The Supreme Court plays a big role in interpreting all this.
So the Constitution was one pillar. What about other institutional changes to protect this new democracy?
Several key changes. The judiciary was strengthened, made more independent, guaranteed tenure for judges, financial autonomy. And in 2004, the National Justice Council, CNJ, was created.
What does the CNJ do?
Its job is basically judicial oversight and accountability, tackling corruption and inefficiency within the courts themselves. Building public trust in the justice system was seen as critical.
And I've heard about participatory budgeting in Brazil.
Ah, yes, that's a fascinating innovation. Pioneered in Porto Alegre in the early 90s, then spread elsewhere. It allows ordinary citizens to directly decide how part of the local government's budget is spent.
How does that work?
Through public meetings, neighborhood assemblies, people debate priorities, vote on projects should money go to a new health clinic, paving a road, improving a school. It gives citizens real power over local spending.
Increasing engagement and accountability.
Hugely. Especially for marginalized communities, it gives them a voice in resource allocation. It's seen as a powerful tool for deepening democracy at the local level.
What about elections themselves? Were there reforms there?
Yes, significant ones. The Superior Electoral Court, TSE, was strengthened as an independent body overseeing elections. And there were major reforms to campaign finance laws, like limits on donations in 2015 and stricter disclosure rules trying to curb corruption and undue influence.
Plus the electronic voting system, right?
Exactly. Brazil has had mandatory electronic voting nationwide for years. It's generally seen as efficient and secure, reducing fraud and speeding up results, which helps build trust in the process. All these things combined aim to make the democracy more robust, transparent, and participatory. And these institutional changes really did reshape political participation. It wasn't just about voting anymore, though that remains central with the mandatory system. People engaged through activism, public debate, and a huge network of civil society organizations.
Groups focused on human rights, land reform, etc.
Exactly. Organizations like the Brazilian Forum on Human Rights, the Pastoral Land Commission, CPT, working with rural communities, IBEs doing social and economic analysis. These groups became crucial. They documented abuses, pushed for the Truth Commission, educated citizens about their rights, mobilized marginalized groups.
Their work was enabled by the new freedoms.
Absolutely. The freedom of speech, assembly, press, guaranteed by the '88 Constitution, allowed civil society to flourish after being suppressed under the dictatorship.
What about labor unions and student movements? They were important historically.
They reemerged strongly, too. Unions played a big role in the final years of the dictatorship, like those massive metalworker strikes in São Paulo's ABC region in the late 70s, early 80s. That's where Lula first rose to prominence. The National Union of Students, UNE, also became a powerful voice for democracy and social change again.
Are these groups still influential today?
They are, but they face challenges. Increasing political polarization means they sometimes get targeted as enemies by certain political factions. The rise of far-right politics under Bolsonaro saw attacks on environmental and human rights groups, for example. Funding can be precarious, too.
And the Constitution also pushed for decentralization, power away from the center.
Yes, that was a key principle, shifting power from the highly centralized military state to a more federal system. Empowering states and municipalities, outlined in Article 18, recognizing Brazil's diversity, allowing local governments to tailor policies better.
Does that work smoothly?
It's complex. It has empowered local actors, but huge disparities in wealth and capacity between regions mean decentralization hasn't always led to more equality. Richer states have more resources to work with. So you still have this constant tension, right, between the need for strong central coordination and the desire for local autonomy in this vast, diverse country. It's a fundamental dynamic in Brazilian politics.
That tension brings us right up to the present day, doesn't it? Brazil's democracy, while robust in many ways, faces some really serious contemporary challenges, corruption being a huge one.
Absolutely huge. And nothing exemplifies that more than Operation Car Wash Operation Lava Jato. Starting around 2014.
That was massive, right? What did it uncover?
It uncovered this incredibly complex, sprawling web of corruption centered on the state oil giant Petrobras, major construction companies like Odebrecht, and politicians from almost every major party. Kickbacks, bribes, illegal campaign financing on an epic scale.
Implicating top figures.
Yes, including former presidents Lula and Dilma Rousseff, numerous ministers, congressmen, business leaders. It shook the entire political establishment to its core.
What was the impact beyond the scandals themselves?
It absolutely cratered public trust in politicians and traditional parties. People felt betrayed, disgusted, and it massively fueled the political polarization that was already simmering. It created this deep sense of disillusionment. And that disillusionment, combined with a painful economic recession and rising concerns about crime, really created the perfect storm for the rise of far-right politics, culminating in Jair Bolsonaro's election in 2018.
How did he tap into that mood?
He positioned himself perfectly as the anti-establishment outsider. The one guy tough enough to clean up the mess, restore order, defend traditional conservative values. He railed against corruption, attacked the system, promised a hard line on crime.
Using social media very effectively.
Incredibly effectively, especially WhatsApp. He largely bypassed traditional media, which he often attacked as biased or fake news. He built a direct connection with his base, using viral messages, memes, often controversial statements to mobilize support and dominate the conversation.
And his policies once in power.
They reflected his campaign themes. Economic liberalization efforts, like pension reform, a very tough-on-crime stance, including loosening gun laws. Controversial environmental policies that led to increased deforestation in the Amazon, a rise of about 22% between 2019 and 2020, drew huge international criticism, and a major shift in foreign policy, aligning closely with the U.S. under Trump.
All of which deepened the polarization.
Massively. Society became incredibly divided. Protests erupted frequently. Human rights groups raised serious concerns. It was a period of intense social and political tension.
Which highlights the role social media now plays.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? It's revolutionized political communication. Candidates can speak directly to voters, mobilize grassroots support, engage younger people, maybe turned off by traditional politics.
But the downside?
The huge downside is the ease with which misinformation and outright fake news can spread. Echo chambers form, where people only see views they agree with. It fuels polarization, makes dialogue harder, and can be manipulated for political gain. It's a massive challenge for democracy everywhere, but particularly potent in Brazil's polarized environment.
So, looking at Brazil today, what are the biggest ongoing challenges for its democracy and society?
There are several critical ones, all interconnected. Economic inequality is perhaps the most persistent. Brazil remains one of the most unequal countries globally.
Yeah.
The gap between the rich and poor is vast. The top 10% earn something like 30 times more than the bottom 10%, and corruption makes it worse, diverting funds from schools, hospitals, services the poor rely on.
And environmental issues, the Amazon.
A huge concern, obviously. Deforestation rates surged under Bolsonaro. While the current Lula administration has pledged to reverse that and strengthen protections, the damage done is immense. And the pressures from agriculture, mining, logging are still intense. It's a global issue with local roots.
Corruption hasn't gone away.
Sadly, no. While Lava Jato exposed a lot, the perception of widespread corruption persists. Surveys showed huge majorities, like 86% in 2018, believed politicians were corrupt. This cynicism corrodes trust and can depress political participation, leading to more blank or null votes, people just checking out.
What about basic services like health and education?
Still facing major weaknesses. The public health system, SUS, is supposed to be universal, but it struggles with funding, access, quality, especially outside major cities. The COVID-19 pandemic brutally exposed these weaknesses. Education also has big challenges: quality issues, inequality in access. Reports show large numbers of students lack basic reading and math skills. This hinders social mobility, long-term development.
And the handling of the pandemic itself became a huge political issue.
Absolutely. Bolsonaro's downplaying the virus, his promotion of unproven treatments, the delays in securing vaccines, it drew enormous criticism and undoubtedly worsened the death toll. It became another flashpoint deepening the political divide.
All feeding into this broader trend of populism.
Yes. Bolsonaro is a classic example of a populist leader challenging elites, tapping into voter anger and distrust, fueled by scandals like Lava Jato, using inflammatory rhetoric to mobilize his base. And the political parties themselves reflect this turbulence. The Workers' Party, PT, is still a major force associated with social programs but damaged by corruption scandals. The center-right PSTB has struggled. And Bolsonaro's PSL party, while initially powerful, fragmented. The whole party system is quite fluid and polarized. So yeah, what does this all mean for Brazil's future? It's a complex picture.
It really is. What an incredible, complex journey we've taken through Brazil's political history, from those deep indigenous roots, through colonialism, slavery, empire, republic, dictatorships, and now this vibrant but challenged democracy.
A lot to take in.
It really is. It shows a nation constantly shaped by its geography, its diversity, that relentless struggle with inequality, the shadow of authoritarianism, but also this incredible resilience, this enduring push for democracy and social justice.
That push is always there.
It is. Brazil's story is just constant interplay of powerful, often conflicting forces. It makes it one of the most crucial and fascinating countries to try and understand today. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. And perhaps the final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. Considering everything we've discussed, Brazil's deep history of clientelism, trading favors for loyalty, those recurring cycles of authoritarian rule, the immense challenge of inequality, how can the country truly break free from these historical patterns? How can it forge a genuinely more equitable, more stable future? Especially when it's constantly trying to balance economic ambition with vital social welfare needs and the urgent protection of its environment. It's a profound question, isn't it? Something that invites continued curiosity about this magnificent, complicated nation.